The galaxy of Warhammer 40k is a vast frontier of variety. Lush paradise worlds, forge worlds, death worlds, and more lay scattered amongst the stars. The Imperium of Man controls a sizable amount of these planets, and maintains the largest interstellar empire in the galaxy. But as we all know, nothing in space is close together. Even when traveling between worlds in the same solar system, the journey can take years, and outside of that, decades, if not centuries or longer. So, how does the Imperium of Man keep this vast, sprawling empire together? Well, they utilize this alternate dimension known as the Warp, an eternal maelstrom, a realm of unimaginable horrors and pleasures. The Warp is a captivating enigma. Besides being home to the Chaos Gods and their minions, the Warp also serves as the primary method of communication and travel between the millions of worlds controlled by the Imperium. How exactly does humanity use the Warp? How is it accessed and navigated? Are there other ways of accessing the Imperium? Let's get into that. Welcome back to Starhammer. Humanity, in our ingenuity, have harnessed the powers of the Warp for practically everything. It's how we took off across the stars and began an interstellar civilization, as it was our solution to faster than light travel. With a device known as a warp drive, a void ship can sail amongst the currents of the warp, but the process for this journey isn't as simple as going from point A to point B. When a ship is loaded up and ready to go, it'll begin a slow acceleration through its current solar system to a location known as a Manderville point, which is the minimum distance a ship can enter and exit the warp safely in a system. It's important to note that the warp is extremely difficult to navigate. Think of the warp as a rough ocean, and the shorter of a distance you go in that ocean, the safer you're going to be. There are two methods for warp navigation: piloted jumps and calculated jumps. The brave souls responsible for achieving such impressive feats are known as navigators. These are specially trained psychers that are intensely sensitive to the warp, and thus are able to determine the best course through it by quite literally riding the psychic currents of pure energy that the warp is made from. Piloted jumps are the most efficient means of warp travel, and generally they make voyages of about 5,000 light years. It's also the most accurate, as the navigators are guided by the psychic might of the Emperor himself through a device known as the Astronomicon. This arcane machine is based on Terra and is sort of a homing beacon for navigators. 1,000 psychers are needed to power it, and through their concentrated efforts, the Emperor is able to help direct ships through the warp. The Astronomicon has a range of about 50,000 light years and holds a roughly spherical shape. But while it allows for safer travels, the farther you get away from it, the more the signal fades. It can also be blocked by events known as warp storms, or even just localized disturbances that would interfere with psychic abilities. Now, these warp storms are a death sentence for any vessel unlucky enough to get caught up in one. And these storms can be so bad and last for so long that large swaths of the galaxy could be isolated for years or even centuries, such as what happened during Old Night that crumbled humanity's first attempt at interstellar expansion. The second method of warp travel is known as a calculated jump. Via the warp drive equipped on all ships, the currents of the warp are calculated to determine the most efficient route to the destination, as well as the approximate travel time. These calculations are made by measuring the energy of the warp relative to the ship traveling within it, and assuming that these energies aren't going to significantly change during the journey. During calculated jumps, the ship is more or less riding the currents and hoping it arrives approximately where it's supposed to. Due to the extremely precarious nature of these kinds of jumps, they're usually only made for very short distances of about 4 to 5 light years. Anything farther than that, and the crew risk the warp pushing them way off course or worse. That being said, shorter warp jumps are more accurate than longer ones. It's generally easier and safer to move from system to system instead of trying to cross a large section of space-time in one go. There are also established warp channels in many major systems, which allow for mostly consistent and safe interstellar travel. Another factor you gotta consider with the warp is the time displacement. Time in real space and warp space are quite different from one another. This table here breaks down the minimum and maximum amount of time that a journey can take as it correlates to distance. So for example, a 100 light year jump would seem to take anywhere from 2.5 to 9.5 hours, but in reality, between 3 days and 3 weeks will have actually passed while the ship was in the warp. But while humanity has achieved warp travel, there are also a few other ways to access this dimension. Warp gates are rare and mysterious structures found throughout the galaxy, and they can be found anywhere from the depths of space to a farmer's field on a planet. No one can say whether they're natural or not, and planetary gates seem to only respond to certain external stimuli, such as psychic or electrical energies, and are usually disguised in some way. Warp gates are incredibly important though, as they essentially form a stable tunnel in the warp that goes from point A to point B without worrying about the usual hazards you would have to encounter. You can imagine then that these are often seen as of great strategic importance to whatever faction comes across them. Warp gates vary in size, some being large enough to allow an entire army to march through them, and others barely large enough for a regular old person to fit through. Regardless, whenever one is discovered, civilizations like the Imperium are always ready to exploit them. Planetary gates typically link to other planets. One must always be prepared for what they could find on the other side. Maybe it's a new but hostile civilization. Maybe it's a resource-rich agri-world. Or maybe you just get dumped into the warp space anyway, as many of these gates that are found appear to be defective in some way. Warp portals are found in a variety of places and take many forms, but function as a direct entrance into or out of the general warp. It's not necessary to engage your warp drive to travel through a portal, but navigation is still required once within the immaterium. Just like their cousins, warp gates and the portals aren't fully understood in how they're made or formed. Warp rifts are probably the most intense place one could enter or exit the warp. Rifts are spots in real space where the veil between the physical world and the ethereal world has been all but destroyed, and a perfect rip in space-time exists. These can occur naturally, but can also be manufactured, being caused by warp drive explosions, demonic summoning rituals, or by the will of the Chaos Gods themselves. Like warp portals, rifts can take many forms, from gaping maws of writhing psychic energy to dark storm clouds or a lake of blood. One of the most famous of these rifts would be the Eye of Terror, which was caused when the overly indulgent Eldari created the Chaos God Slaanesh, with Slaanesh's birth screams ripping open the massive wound in real space that now serves as the home for the traitor Astartes legions and their demonic compatriots. Now, I've said that the warp is dangerous, but why? As I've said, navigators using the light of the Astronomicon should be able to guide their ship through the warp without running into much trouble, but oftentimes it's not that easy. Keyword should. Similar to sailors on Earth, all sorts of entities are waiting to prey upon the helpless crew of a void ship. The demons of chaos are always ready to pounce upon traveling ships, as they and other warp entities are drawn to the psychic signals produced by living beings. To combat these threats, ships are equipped with Geller field generators. Geller fields are essentially projected bubbles of real space that surround a ship as it moves through the warp. Since the warp or its denizens can't pierce real space except under specific circumstances, like an open rift for example, a ship maintaining this bubble is protected as it travels. Geller field technology comes in a few different variants, and it's changed a lot over the years, with one design even requiring living psychers to use as batteries. How this would work is that the psychers are kept in a comatose state, whereby they basically astrally project their vision of reality outwards to form this bubble of real space. Essentially, they use their sweet dreams to keep the crew safe. Most of these living batteries would die after a few trips, so they were constantly being recycled, and it was generally an inefficient but very effective way of protecting the vessel. But as with any machine, Geller field generators are doomed to fail eventually. When this happens, the results are catastrophic. Even if they don't fail entirely, a weakened shield can give chaos demons just the opening they need to get in there and prey upon the crew. And that's all for this one, folks. Remember to like if you like it, subscribe if you really liked it, and comment down below what you want to see next and what your thoughts are. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and keep up with my community tab to stay up to date on all my latest shenanigans. I'll see y'all in the next one. Toodles.